Hello, my name is Rodolfo Ragonesi and welcome to another episode of Geopolitika. Today with me I have Jason Giardina, who is going to be participating in a debate that is the vaccine debate. We'll start with vaccines in general and then we'll go on to some specifics. So why have we chosen this debate? Well, it's something that many people, especially in the medical community, in the public health sector, refuse to debate. And of course, there's no subject which should be out of the limits of debate. Now we need to debate them all. And unfortunately, there's a lot of labeling going on. So the moment someone tries to debate something or question anything, whether it's efficacy, safety, choice, informed consent, whatever it happens to be, they automatically label people.
Yeah.
And they're labeling anti-vaxxers. What is interesting is that if you look at the definitions and you're going into some libraries online or rather dictionaries, I should say, online, they started to change the definition of what constitutes an anti-vaxxer. So it's now not only become part of the vocabulary, an anti-vaxxer, but it's also being defined differently. Today, I came across one of these definitions, and an anti-vaxxer is now being defined in one particular dictionary as a person who opposes the use of some or all vaccines, regulating or regulations, mandating vaccination, or usually both. Now, why do I mention this? That's interesting because it says who opposes the use of some vaccines. So it's not necessarily someone who is specifically against vaccination, period.
And the definition presupposes that the vaccines are all of the same constituents, which is obviously not the case, because if there are certain vaccines which are different than others, created differently than others, then obviously one would have to look at each individual vaccine as it stands.
Exactly.
But if they're going to say that you are opposed to some of them, therefore you're opposed to all of them, then that would necessarily presuppose that they're all the same.
You get stuck. Definitions are so important. And once you start changing definitions, you're changing the way people are thinking and acting in society. So we know that there are certain vaccines that have been withdrawn from the market. We know that there are vaccines that have been, they have admitted even on the WHO website that they were, for example, faulty. There was one that was withdrawn, I believe, in the 1980s or 1970s after 55 persons.
That was a swine flu vaccine. That was
the swine flu. After 55 persons had been reported to have died subsequent to taking the vaccines. It doesn't necessarily mean they died necessarily of the vaccine, but they were reported to have died subsequent to the vaccines, and it was taken
off the
market. So imagine it was not taken off the market, and you were one of those persons who was speaking out saying that needs to be taken off the market. You would have been labeled, according to today's definition, as an anti-vaxxer. So, of course, labeling is wrong, and it's demeaning of any debate. But unfortunately, we end up getting dragged into a tit for tat. It's like kids play. When they start talking, oh, you're this and you're that. And so the kids come, oh, yes, I'm this, so you're that. It's very childish.
Tends to be the last refuge of someone without an argument.
Yes, it's very childish. But unfortunately, they pull you into a tit for tat. So, because they're categorizing. If people are being labeled, we hear questioning, so we're going to be labeled.
Yeah.
So, okay, what are the other side? So if we are categorized as anti-vaxxers, what makes the others?
That's right.
And vax pushers.
It's a disingenuous attempt to categorize to categorize a group of people whose belief system is inadequate or not able to think properly. So as opposed to addressing the actual issues that they're bringing forward, you just categorize them and therefore you can just disregard them.
And dismissing, labeling and dismissing. Because we could easily go on till the cows come home saying, well, all the others are vax pushers. They're vax pushers, like drug pushers. This is what we want to reduce to the debate. between the anti-vaxxers and the vax pushers,
And
rather than talking about the merits of the case.
And it creates tribal thinking. You have one tribe
Tribalism.
against another, and it doesn't matter what one tribe says to the other because you're not going to convince them, and therefore it's really like you say, it's dismissive of the whole the whole issue.
The debate itself. So an interesting point coming off the definition is it was mentioning someone who's against mandating vaccination. So this is also interesting. I mean, define mandating. So there is this idea that a number of vaccines are mandatory. There might be laws that actually use the word mandatory, but are they really mandatory? Because if something is mandatory, then you are forced to do something, right? You are never forced. Now, this is not an interpretation or an opinion. This is reading the actual law.
Right.
The laws themselves on vaccination do not force anyone to take any vaccine. Any vaccine. But they use the word mandatory. It is not mandatory. If it were mandatory, then a court of law or a government official would have the power to force a person to take a vaccine. That does not exist. What you have is, if, for example, a parent does not give informed consent to the medical authorities to have their children vaccinated, remember the parents are the legal guardians of the child, therefore the state cannot intervene and vaccinate a child without the consent of the parents are the legal guardians, then the guardians, the parents, can be fined. But a fine does not mean that the vaccine is mandatory. It's a kind of slap on the wrist. It's saying, we feel as the state that you should give consent. Because you haven't given consent, we're going to fine you. It's an administrative fine. Usually it's like around 50 euros. That doesn't mean that it's obligatory, because you can pay the fine. But the court cannot oblige you to vaccinate the child. That's the difference. So it's not actually mandatory.
Right. In fact, this occurred in the United States, and this is the basis on which many people say that a government can force you to get vaccinated. There was a case where a parent took the United States government to court because they refused to have their child vaccinated. It went all the way up to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court decided that the government can mandate the fine, but not the actual vaccination. Exactly. And this is the legal basis on which many vaccine advocates say that the government can force someone to get vaccinated, but it's not actually the case. They can force the fine, but not the vaccination.
Exactly. Now you mentioned the Supreme Court of the United States. There is a case in the European Court of Human Rights, which I believe it was last year, 2022, which actually reached the same conclusion. It's Wawrinka, it's known as the Wawrinka case, where the court is not actually saying that mandating is acceptable. It is simply saying what constitutes something which is proportionate, because the rule of proportionality is very important when deciding whether you've infringed a person's human rights or not. Is the law proportionate to what it seeks to achieve in public policy? If it is disproportionate, then you've gone beyond the line and it's considered to be unconstitutional. If it's proportionate, then it's okay. And it said it is proportionate to have a fine. It doesn't mean that the fine is breaching your constitutional rights, because it's proportionate. The government, the state, is trying to push a policy, and it's helping to push its policy by introducing a fine. So it hasn't breached your rights because you paid a fine.
Right.
It said as long as you're not physically forcing the child.
Right.
The Wawrinka case says that. So the Wawrinka case, we're talking about the European Court of Human Rights here, so the supreme body when it comes to determining human rights, is saying if you were to force the child physically, then that would be different. Then you would be breaching human rights. That is the big difference. You see?
And when we look at a specific situation, like we're talking about COVID vaccines, which are still experimental, or at the time of the rollout, we're still experimental, then we have the Nuremberg Code, which forbids the mandating or the forced implementation of an experimental drug on someone who doesn't give consent. So there is law, international law, which forbids the mandating of an experimental drug.
This is something that has been up for debate for the last 2 years. There's been a lot of quoting the Nuremberg Code. Part of the Nuremberg Code is in fact stating that you cannot impose an intervention upon a person without his consent, whether or not it is experimental. The fact that it is experimental is even more the case.
Right.
Case. So there are two principles here. You cannot force any intervention, but neither can you force any form of trial, because that would constitute experimenting, using an experimental drug and therefore forcing a person. So there are actually, yes, two issues.
This word mandate that governments tend or like to use, especially when it came to the situation of COVID, I think is a very devious way of playing upon people's psychological belief that because government usually passes law, and they do so in an appropriate way, usually through parliament or what have you, that since they are mandating, then obviously they must have the authority to do so. And it's a very devious play on people's psychology, because they're using words which are very close to what we call laws, but aren't laws. And if you actually look at the law, you see that there's nothing there. But they disseminate this word mandate through the media, and people think that it's something like a law.
That's why we started this debate, because the word mandate is so important to the debate. A lot in the last couple of years, they've used the word mandate when they felt it appropriate.
Yes.
Because they tried to work very hard at saying, no, we're not actually mandating the COVID vaccine. So we're not mandating it. But then on the other hand, they were using coercion.
That's right.
Now, coercion is illegal. You cannot coerce someone to enter into a relationship with you. You cannot coerce someone into signing a contract with you.
Not just local law, but even international law.
Basically, these are international principles of law.
Right,
coercion is illegal. So if you tell people, no, we're not mandating any vaccine, but you cannot go to your graduation if you're not vaccinated. You cannot go into a restaurant. You cannot travel freely. You have to be locked up at home under quarantine.
And interestingly enough,
so that is a form of coercion.
They would offload that coercion onto private entities like businesses, and forcing businesses to do the actual wet work, of marginalizing people and coercing. So it's quite something to see.
Well, in Italy, for example, it was more draconian than it was in Malta, where you could not be employed, if you were not vaccinated with the COVID vaccine.
Although
so that is a massive form of
although if you push that, from what we could gather, if you push that, there were cases where like you push it to the legal extent, then the companies would back off because they realized they had no legal standing.
Well, yes, I think there's a lot of persuasive tactics being used, which is strong arm tactics. So whether it's threatening that you can't graduate, that you can't go to a restaurant, you can't travel, and so on and so forth without restrictions, you can't work, they're obviously strong arm tactics. On the other hand, there's a body of vaccines which they are saying are actually mandated. Okay, in the Maltese law, they say there are 4 vaccines that you have to take. But again, technically, parents are not obliged to give their consent.
Here we're talking about the childhood schedule, the MMR.
Yes. No, it's not. MMR is not obligatory.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
This is something which is, again, very important for people to understand. I mean, it's the tetanus, which is obligatory.
Diphtheria.
It's diphtheria, pertussis, and there's a 4th, which escapes me right now. It's basically it's the other 3 in 1, unless it's a 4 in 1, which would include tetanus, the DTaP.
Right,
diphtheria,
the DTaP.
tetanus,
That's right. Yeah,
pertussis,
and it's interesting because
and polio.
In countries like in North America, where we used in the past 40, 50 years ago, it was just these 4 that you were talking about. Today, it's upwards of...
Depends on the country.
Right.
Yes. Depends on in Malta, it's still 4. But again, it's not strictly speaking mandatory.
That's
now,
right.
This is why they don't like to debate these things in public. Because, I mean, law is my background. This is my professional opinion. When you look at the law itself, it tells you that you are subject to a fine if you do not give your consent as a parent. That does not mean that any court is authorized by law to force the vaccination of a child.
Right.
The law does not give you that power. It does not give the state that power. So is it really mandatory? There's an administrative fine, but you are never forced to actually give any form of vaccine. But then there's another issue. There are many people who go to their doctors and they say, yes, you have to give the child these vaccines. And it would not be just 4, it would be many others. They would use the word have to. Define have to. Have to because the law says you have to, or have to because the medical advisor, the doctor, is saying, well, you have to, as in like, I'm asking for directions in the street to go to Melleha, and you say, yes, if you want to go to Melleha, you have to turn left. But you don't actually have to turn left, because if you miss that turning, you can take another route. So it's a way of speaking, you have to. It's advisable that.
And let's talk about that.
Yeah,
Because
that's a big difference, because the patient is not going to understand that.
Right.
They would understand at face value. If you say you have to, they will understand, oh, it's obliged to. But that's not what they mean.
And do doctors have a financial interest in advising their patients to take these vaccines?
That's a very interesting question. In Malta, I have no idea. In other countries, unfortunately, in some countries, yes. We know for a fact that there are doctors in the United States that are being compensated by the pharmaceutical industry, I believe to the tune of about $40 for each vaccination, or each vaccinated child. However, the plot thickens, because what the pharmaceutical industry does to motivate these doctors is they would give them a certain threshold. They'd have to cross that threshold in order to get compensated.
Like a certain quota.
A quota, precisely. So if you are running a clinic, they will give you €40 per child vaccinated, only if you reach your quota of 1,000 children. And then they give you 40,000. They're not going to give you 4,000 if you vaccinated 100. But they will give you 40,000 only if you've reached 1,000. Is that not a conflict of interest?
It's like the drug pusher at the schoolyard.
Well, there you go. Again, we're going back to the term vax pusher.
Right.
Are there some doctors in some countries in the world that are becoming vax pushers because they have a financial incentive to push the vaccines? Because this is what we call a conflict of interest.
This is a big issue that really needs to be addressed, not just locally, but even internationally, regarding the money aspect in healthcare, because it seems to have permeated right across the board, right into the regulatory bodies, the FDA, the CDC, WHO, something which acts detrimentally to health.
There are two main issues that the general principles of law have always highlighted. Two important issues. Number one, the issue of a conflict of interest. So if you are, for example, a director on a company, and you're taking decisions that would be in your interest as an individual and not as a company, then that constitutes a conflict of interest. Right. You are going against your fiduciary duties, and you can be thrown out and no longer remain a director. You could actually be prohibited from taking up another role as a director because of your conflict of interest. So if doctors are being paid by the pharmaceutical lobby to vaccinate children, does that not constitute a conflict of interest? Because there's the financial gain on the one hand, and there is the obligation of the doctor to advise a patient according to the individual needs of that specific patient, and not to go to try to fulfill quotas. So obviously there is a potential conflict of interest. And the whole idea of law is that you try to avoid potential conflicts of interest. You see? Now, those interests they could merge. You could say, well, my financial interests and the interests of the child happen to coincide. Okay, they happen to coincide. But the point is you want to avoid that.
Right.
Because it's very important to show transparency. If there is a potential conflict of interest, you have to avoid that potential conflict. And that is not happening in many countries. This is why the pharmaceutical industry, unfortunately, there's like there is mafia in any other industry, there are mafia tendencies in any large enterprise, in any large industry. Where there is money involved, there is corruption, there is coercion, there are financial incentives, and we know that a lot of pharmaceutical companies, we don't need to name any of them here, but there are a number of pharmaceutical companies that have paid billions of dollars and billions of euros in compensation out of court settlements, or maybe settlements in court, for civil damages, but also criminal damages.
That's right.
Criminal damage, in other words, for carrying out fraud, for bribing doctors. These are all documented. You should just look for them on the website. Look for example, U.S. Department of Justice and pharmaceutical out-of-court settlements, and you will see what will come up. Billions of dollars being paid. And
beyond the what I call the positive influence in terms of doctors receiving funds, we also have now, in the COVID case, we have negative influence by governments putting pressure on doctors not to discuss vaccines. For example, the COVID vaccines, we have a legislation in California which has just recently passed where they prohibit doctors from discussing the negative aspects of vaccines or anything regarding COVID. So you've got two elements at play here. One where you are financially incentivizing doctors to push the vaccines, and one where you are creating obstacles from doctors who actually discuss any negative aspects of these vaccines, which is, I mean, you're basically tying the doctors not only to their hands but their feet at the same time. And what are patients to do? They go to doctors because doctors are considered the authorities when it comes to their health and the health of their families. Yes. Who else can they get the truth from?
Yes, I mean, obviously people have a lot of faith, try to have a lot of faith in their medical advisors. And one of the most important principles in medical practice is to do no harm. And therefore it is the obligation of doctors to make sure that the advice they are given does not lead, as far as they can, to harming their patients. And therefore, if the state or any organ of the state tries to put pressure on doctors not to speak to their patients or to speak out against the negative effects or the possible injuries of vaccines, etc., that is a big problem, because they are interfering with the confidential relationship between the doctor and patient.
Privilege between doctors and patients.
The privilege, and also the obligation of the doctor, as we said, to do no harm. So they actually have an obligation to tell people, listen, no, we don't feel comfortable with this particular vaccine, for example. Take the case of pregnant women. In the past, before the COVID period arrived, pregnant women were never being administered any form of vaccine.
That's right.
Now suddenly even that has changed.
Not even an aspirin they would be advised to take.
Yes. So if a pregnant woman has said, listen, this is not even my first pregnancy, I've been through all this I have never touched any sort of vaccine before. Now I'm pregnant, or I'm planning to become pregnant. There's this new vaccine, which also happens still to be a trial basis, even though many people, including on the islands of Malta, were saying, no, they're no longer on a trial basis, they're no longer experimental. And that was absolutely false information.
That's right.
Of course they were experimental. They are still
experimental,
stage.
That's right.
The trial stage comes to an end at the end of this year, 2023.
That's right.
So we still have another 9 months to go. And there were still people coming out in the media, including media and journalists, etc., who unfortunately were not doing their job, and saying, oh no, it's not experimental, it's not experimental.
They're making the impossible claim that these vaccines were safe. And that is as soon as you hear that, you have to come to the conclusion that something is wrong, because there is no way of determining whether a new novel vaccine is safe unless you are actually looking at the short, medium, and long-term consequences of those vaccines.
Well, and define safe. Again, you always have to define your terms.
Right.
When you use the word safe, it means it's safe all the time, and not 1 in 10,000 cases it's not safe, 1 in 100,000 cases it's not safe. Because if that's the case, you have to specify and say, listen, in 1 in 1,000 cases, or etc., this can happen, that can happen. This is the law. This has always been the law, that all the vaccine manufacturers, they have their information brochures, leaflets, that have to include all the potential side effects. And if you were to see the information, the literature on all the vaccines that have come out since the very first one, they all have a long list of potential side effects, some of them being very serious side effects. And almost all those flyers have said they could also lead to death. So almost all of them. We're not talking about the COVID vaccines. We're talking about all the vaccines. Right. If people were to read that literature, they would see that all the vaccines say that they could lead to serious injury or even to death. All of them. So how on earth can you come up and say that any vaccine is safe?
Well, not only that, how can you mandate an intervention like a vaccine where one of the possible consequences of taking it is death
or serious injury?
Or serious injury, and say you must take that. That would be, it's morally...
Exactly. And then there is the other issue of informed consent. Now, informed consent means that you are informed of everything. You are informed of the possibility of injury, what sort of injuries, what sort of effects, the possibility of death. You are informed of whether there are alternatives. Are there alternatives as regards prevention? Are there alternatives as regards remedy? So that you can really make your choice and say, well, if there's no other alternative, then I choose to take the vaccine. If on the other hand, I see that there's an alternative, then I choose not to take the vaccine. That doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer.
That's right.
That makes you informed to the point where you make your choice, because the choice is yours as a patient. It's not the choice of a state to impose. So at the end of the day, if that information is not complete because there is an effort to hide information regarding alternatives and other remedies or prevention, etc., that is not informed consent.
Well, not only that, if one of the options of informed consent was to deny taking the medication, and that denial was socially unacceptable, then you wouldn't even have consent. You would have something else. Because in order to consent, you have to weigh the proposition and decide one way or the other. And if deciding one way is not acceptable, then you don't have consent, you have mandates.
Yes. And remember that if there is coercion, there is no consent. In law, we say that consent is vitiated. It's vitiated consent because you have given your consent based on coercion, or based upon misinformation or a lack of information, and that is not informed consent. So that consent is vitiated because it was not properly informed. And when people were informed, for example, that the COVID vaccines were safe, that was absolutely incorrect.
That's right.
No matter what they say today, because even if you look at the CDC website, it tells you specifically that there are a number of possible side effects, including myocarditis. Therefore, how can you say that it's safe? You cannot say that it's safe. Now that they are specific, you can't have your cake and eat it. Either you say, listen, we've done all the trials. They haven't even done all the trials. We don't know what the long-term effects are because we haven't reached that period where we are long-term. It's only a couple of years.
That's right. And therefore?
But they're also specifically stating that, for example, myocarditis could be one of the effects.
So therefore they're not safe. Exactly.
They are not safe.
They're not safe.
And yet they were telling people when they were taking them that they were safe.
And now,
therefore, all the so-called consent that was being given, which was a tacit consent, is all vitiated because it was based upon incorrect facts.
And now the truth seems to be coming out, where we're seeing more and more side effects of these vaccines.
Well, this is interesting because if you look at the VAERS, the VAERS system, it is a United States system, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. you will see, in fact, that the number of reports in the first slide that we have here is referring to how many people were reported to have died following the taking of the COVID vaccines. And the number we have listed is 34,517. Not 3 persons, not 35, not 350, not 3,000, 34,517.
These are deaths.
These are persons who died following the taking of the vaccine.
Right.
Now, the argument against this is, because you are all anti-vaxxers, you're giving misinformation.
Right. You're correlating.
It doesn't mean that they all died because of the vaccine.
That's right.
We are not saying that they all died because of the vaccine. What we are saying is there is a red flag system set up by the medical authorities themselves. Doctors or patients or another person can report. They have to report if someone died or has some major medical condition after taking a vaccine, whether or not the vaccine was the cause. They have to report it. Now, apparently there are studies, it is widely known within the medical establishment, that even the VAERS reporting is very, very underreported. Right. Very underreported.
On a scale, I think, of 1 to 10 times.
1 to 10. There could be as many as 10 times more what is being reported. In other words, for 10 cases, only 1 is being reported. Right. So it could be that instead of being 34,000,
it's 340,000.
240. But let's not go there.
All right.
Let us say there are 34,000. The counter-argument is, but that doesn't mean that they were caused by the vaccine.
It's correlation, not causation.
Fair enough. It's correlation, not causation. But the point is you have an early warning system. Now, if you look at the next slide that we have here, the same VAERS reporting system tells you that if you were to look at how many people were reported to have died from following the taking of any vaccine, not COVID vaccines, any vaccine in all of the last 32 years, since 1990. Not COVID vaccines the last 2 years.
All of them.
All the vaccines put together of all the last 32 years. The full number, including those who died of the following the COVID vaccines, the total number is 44,581. What does that tell you? It means that in 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, there were approximately 10,000 who were reported to have died following the taking of any of the vaccines. 10,000 in 30 years. Now, the last 2 years, another 34,000. Now, is that not a red flag? Is that
absolutely
not a red flag? Because is this not why you have data?
That's right.
The data doesn't mean that you've proven anything.
That's what the VAERS is for, right? So that if we get red flags,
but is not every single study done that way? And when you have a control group and you have the study group, what is making the difference? You're not proving that if you have a higher number in the study group than the control group, doesn't necessarily mean that you're proving that there is a link. But on the other hand, you carry out the study because you are looking at tendencies and mathematical probabilities.
That's right.
And the mathematical probability is telling you, yes, there probably is an indication of a link. All studies are based on data. So is this not the same thing? This is a worldwide data, an American data, but you can put the data online even if you're in another country. And this data speaks for itself.
And some people will argue, as you rightly put, that that the data is unreliable. But then,
why is it unreliable?
Well, I don't believe it is. Actually, in fact, if
you have 34,000 recorded deaths following the vaccines, not as a result of, but following the vaccines. We know that there were 55 reported deaths following the vaccines of the swine flu in I think the 1970s. After 55, they stopped it. it doesn't mean that those 55 meant they were caused by the flu, the swine flu vaccine, but they
still stopped it anyway.
Why did they not stop it after 34,517?
Well, the thing is,
I mean, hello.
The thing is, too, is that if they claim that the VAERS is an unreliable database, there exists another database which people don't seem to be wanting to talk about, and that is the U.S. military database, who are also carrying out or recording adverse events and deaths after the COVID vaccine. And that database is showing numbers which are very close. In fact, they are even worse than what's being reported in VAERS. And so if this database that we call VAERS is unreliable, well, what other database is there? Because it's the only one that exists.
You can't say that it's unreliable because it's existed for 30 years. It has a purpose. It has a function.
Well, and let's say,
and you have the same thing with the British military base. I think it's called the Green Gun system.
Yes,
the Germans have their own system.
Yes.
The European has its own system. We're supposed to have our own system, but here in Malta, the information is still not made public.
Well,
so and for what reason?
Well, let's say,
if you were to give informed consent, you need to know how many people have had negative effects following the vaccines in Malta. But that information is not given. So automatically, any consent you might give today is vitiated consent because that information is being withheld.
Which leads to the question of if VAERS is not a reliable database, then where is the reliable database? Why don't we have it? If we're going to roll out these vaccines for a pandemic, we should have a system which is reliable so that, as you say, when we have these red flag situations, we can address them. But if we're going to just claim that the VAERS is not reliable, then we actually have nothing, and we should have something because
it's a question of changing the goalposts. Before COVID came along, no one said that VAERS was unreliable.
That's
now,
right.
Because it's exploded with 34,517 deaths, they're saying now suddenly it's unreliable.
And the emergency use authorization dictates that we have to have a reliable system for recording of adverse events.
Exactly. So, I mean, if we look at the next slide that we can put on the screen, and because they're saying there's no correlation. So let us see if there could possibly be a correlation. So we have here a list of over 4,000 persons who were reported, 4,114, who were registered as having died the same day they took the COVID-19 vaccine, the very same day. So in all, we're saying the number of deaths following vaccination was 34,570, of which 4,114 were the very same day.
Over 10%.
There's 10%. There's no correlation. So let's see how much there's no correlation. Why was the percentage, the number, so much higher on the first day than overall?
Right.
That's the first question.
That's a marker of causation.
That's a marker. The second is, we don't have another screen here, but we don't need to. Anyone could check the data. But if you look at the day after the vaccination.
Second day.
Yes. Well, it's called day one, actually, because day 0 means the same day.
All right, okay.
And that's
so
how
day
it's
one,
listed.
right.
Day 1, you have 3,123.
Another 10%.
And then day 2, 1,477. So it peaks on the same day to over 4,000, and then it starts going down to 3,000 on the first day after, and 1,400, half as many, the next day. There's no correlation.
They should be consistent across the board.
Who are you kidding?
That's right.
Because you're either going to speak to professional statisticians who know how to understand and interpret statistics. And then let's see if they'll put their reputation on the line as professional statisticians to say there's no correlation. Okay? This is basically it. I mean, there are many other aspects that maybe we can do a follow-up program another day. But I think another important issue is the all-cause mortality.
Yes, we don't seem to be addressing that issue.
Excess deaths. This is a massive time bomb.
It's coming to the fore. And
it's a massive time bomb. Because if you see the number of deaths that have taken place over the last 20, 30 years, and the number of deaths that have started to be registered in 2021 and 22, they are far, far higher. They are at an alarming rate, higher than the previous years.
Not to mention that those countries who have high vaccination rates are being recorded as having the highest excess death rates in 2022.
In other words, the deaths in that country were higher than in previous years. And we're not talking about the COVID year. We're not talking about 2020. Yeah? We're talking about the vaccine years.
That's right, 2022.
Because people say, because of COVID, the excess deaths. No. When there was the COVID outbreak at its peak, the deaths were lower than the vaccine years.
In fact, even insurance companies now in their annual reports are reporting excess death rates, which are not COVID related. They're being very specific. And when we talk about insurance companies, we are talking about statisticians who, they know their numbers because they can't afford to fool around.
Yes, because they'll go bankrupt.
They'll go bankrupt.
Exactly.
And they're stating quite clearly that these are non-COVID deaths.
Exactly.
So one has to ask, you have insurance companies telling you these are non-COVID deaths. We have excess death rates in countries which have the highest vaccination rates across the world. So what's happening here? Are we saying that this is not causal? At the very least, we should be governments across the world should be addressing this issue and taking steps to look into what's happening.
And remember, maybe we can conclude on this point, that for many, many years, in every field of human endeavor, there is the principle that we call the precautionary principle. You always act on the basis of caution. And yet, we threw all caution out of the window. We threw all caution out of the window at the trial stage, at the experimental stage, and even at the administration of the vaccine stage, and afterwards. And no matter what number of red flags might be raised,
we continue to push them.
Pushing. It's as though it is more important to push the vaccines across the board,
I dare say,
than to listen and to read those red flags.
It's almost criminal, what we're doing right now.
Well, I think it's almost beyond criminal, because your first duty is to do no harm. And if there are the signs that there could be harm, or that there is harm, and you keep pushing, then you've reached a point where you can hardly...
You become complicit.
Well, you are complicit, because if you don't follow the rules of the road and you kill someone, you are responsible for a crime. That's which we call negligence, criminal negligence. This would constitute criminal negligence if you keep pushing something which could harm someone, even though the data is telling you, listen, this could be harmful, and you push it. That could very easily constitute criminal negligence to many of these people who are pushing this vaccine regime across the world, in any country. That is a form of criminal negligence. There's no doubt in my mind.
Absolutely.
As a legal opinion, that would constitute criminal negligence. So people need not to listen just to one side of a story. They need informed consent. People need to do their own research. Don't be afraid of being labeled anti-vaxxer, anti-this, anti-that. Especially when
it's too much at stake for that now.
Especially when it comes to pregnant women.
Exactly.
Do not be afraid of being labeled, being called this, being called, what the English expression says, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words could never hurt me. And people are afraid of words. They're afraid of being labeled.
That's right.
They're afraid of being
marginalized,
of being marginalized. The people's safety and health and safety, and that of children even more so, because we're responsible to take decisions for them. That is the most important.
That's
for
right.
sure. It's not a question of being labelled an anti-vaxxer. Safety comes first. If we're talking about the manufacture of a car, and there is a particular model of car that hasn't gone through the proper safety tests, or it's failed the safety tests, and it's still on the market, and you say there's a problem with that car, that doesn't make you anti-car, does it? You're not anti-car.
That's right.
If I choose to have organic food which doesn't have pesticides, organic vegetables, that doesn't make me anti-vegetable, does it?
That's right.
It makes me anti-pesticide. So I would be anti-toxins.
If I give you a cup of fluid and tell you to drink it without telling you what's in it, if you don't ask me what's in it,
I'm not anti-fluid.
You're not anti-fluid.
No. Well, I think that was an interesting debate. I'm sure there's loads of more things to discuss, which we could leave for another episode. Time. So thank you very much, Jason.
Thanks, Rodolfo.
And thank you to all of you watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.